Chris Mackowski for the American Battlefield Trust, and we are at Locust Grove here in Virginia. I'm going to talk about the Mine Run campaign for the 160th anniversary. It is a Chamber of Commerce day, blue skies above us, a little cool, a little bit of a breeze, but much nicer weather than it was back in November of 1863. If we were to head down in that direction off to my right, that'd take us to the Wilderness Battlefield, just a couple miles down the road. This is the Orange Turnpike here, right to my left. If we were to go that way, we'll take it all the way to Orange Courthouse. No, the roads aren't color-coded like they are on a map. It's the County of Orange and its county seat. So this road is going to be one of two key roads that are part of this campaign. The other, off to my rear, is going to be the Old Plank Road, or the Orange Plank Road. Same roads that are going to bring these armies into the wilderness at the beginning of the Overland Campaign of 1864. But in the late fall of 1863, these roads are going to play an important part to bring these armies together in a clash that could have been of Gettysburg-sized proportions, turns out not to be, and as a result, things get overlooked. But the stakes for George Gordon Meade, commander of the Army of the Potomac, could not be higher at this moment. Lots going on all across the map, and so there's pressure on Meade. To talk a little bit about all those things going on all across the map, I want to bring in my colleague, Sarah Bierle. Sarah, now we've got lots of things, lots of pieces moving on the puzzle. Meade's just one of them. Let me do the mic switch here.
Thanks, Chris. Yes, as Chris said, there's a lot going on in the fall of 1863, and I know for many years when I was starting off reading Civil War books, I would think 1863, you know, we've got Gettysburg, Vicksburg, then there's like this gap on the timeline, or at least it can be seen that way sometimes until you get to, the battles out in the Western Theater at the end of the year. But there's a lot more that's happening. There's maneuvering that's happening in Virginia. Meade and Lee are still up against each other, even though there hasn't been these huge battles again in Virginia. But what's happening in the fall of 1863 is there's a lot of pressure on George Gordon Meade to do something else, and you're going to hear more about that from my colleagues in the next few minutes. But let's take a little bit of a step back and see what else is happening at high level in a Civil War world in 1863. So let's focus in on November 19th. Abraham Lincoln delivers what we now call the Gettysburg Address. He's present at the dedication of the Soldiers' National Cemetery at Gettysburg. It is a moment where he's starting to lay groundwork for his presidential run. 1864, of course, being a presidential election year, and Lincoln's up for re-election. So he's looking at things politically, certainly. And then, of course, it's that moment of memory, memorializing, starting to try to find closure to that huge battle that happened at Gettysburg. Shifting a little bit our gaze out to the Western Theater, the Siege of Knoxville is starting to happen toward the middle and end of November. Then you have the armies confronting each other around Chattanooga. We're going to have the Battle of Lookout Mountain, the attack on Missionary Ridge, which are going to be large-scale Union victories that are really important for the Union cause as the year is coming to its close. And yet here in Virginia, what's happening? There's some marching around, there's some sitting in camps, and there's a lot of pressure coming in on Commander of the Army of the Potomac, George Gordon Meade. Chris, do you want to fill in a little more with that?
Sure. Now, it's really important to remember that, as Meade is moving this army here in the fall, he's got his eye looking toward the election of 64. He knows that his counterpart out west, Ulysses S. Grant, has just scored that big victory at Chattanooga. In fact, word of that comes on the day that this movement begins. And they say it's pretty good news to march on. But Grant's doing something big. Well, Meade's got to do something big. Expectations are pretty high. We're going to get away from some of the traffic here, but again, one of the things that, this is really important because this is the Army, this is what's going to bring these armies to this area, and this intersection is going to be really important. So Meade's been struggling throughout the fall to get some traction, to have that next big battle, to follow up on Gettysburg. To talk a little bit about how successful or not he's been, I'm going to bring on my good friend Dan Davis to talk a little bit about some of those actions.
Thanks, Chris. Now, as we've talked about, Ulysses S. Grant has scored a victory not only at Vicksburg back in July of 1863, but also more recently in relieving the siege at Chattanooga. But Meade at the same time has also had his own victories, although on a smaller scale in Virginia. He's won a victory at Bristoe Station in October, and he's followed it up more recently on November 7th with twin victories in the fights at Rappahannock Station, or modern Remington, and at Kelly's Ford. And those two battles are often overlooked in their importance, because going back to the previous December of 1862, in the Battle of Fredericksburg, the Rappahannock River has been the dividing line between the Union and Confederate armies. Lee has held the Rappahannock for the better part of a year, but he's going to be pushed away from the Rappahannock during those two engagements. He's forced to fall back toward and beyond the Rapidan River and here into Orange County. He's giving up territory between the Union Army and his capital at Richmond, territory that Lee will never be able to reclaim through the course of the war. Now, after those victories, the Union Army is going to move into Culpeper County off to our north, just across the Rapidan River. Lee's going to set up a line stretching from Orange Courthouse off to the west, beyond Orange Courthouse, in fact, stretching all the way up and along the Rapidan. And Meade is going to begin looking, even though the weather is turning progressively colder, he's going to begin looking for an opportunity to strike the Confederates. He's going to travel to Washington to meet with Secretary of War Edwin Stanton and General-in-Chief Henry Halleck. And the three men are going to lay out plans for Meade to launch an offensive against Lee's army, at least before the weather gets too cold and the two armies are going to be forced to go into winter quarters. And to talk about that plan and the Union movement, I'm going to bring Chris Mackowski back on.
Now, Meade's been taking a lot of criticism from his superiors in Washington, second-guessing what he's doing, a lot of armchair generaling. And the thing I love about Meade at this point is he basically says, look, if you don't like what I'm doing, you can have my resignation. I didn't ask for this job. I took it out of duty. You don't like it, do it. And then Halleck particularly be like, oh, no, everything's fine, everything's fine. Meade often says how gracious Lincoln is during this period. Lincoln's very supportive. So there's a little good cop, bad cop going on at that point. But Halleck even says to Meade, Lee is unquestionably bullying you. And Meade just isn't quite sure what to do. So he thinks maybe I could swing off to Fredericksburg. There's an infrastructure there that would allow me to push south and to make a stab at Richmond. Lincoln says, no, after what happened at Fredericksburg last time, almost a year earlier, the country can't survive another winter defeat along the Rappahannock there. So that's basically taken out. So every time Meade comes up with an idea, Washington nixes it. And so finally he comes up with this idea to try to push around Lee's position, come through this area, consolidate at this intersection around Robinson's Tavern, push forward down toward Orange, and turn Lee's flank, perhaps even getting as far as into Lee's rear, disrupting his supply lines. One of the things I like about this plan is that Meade's got a general idea of what he wants to have happen, but he also leaves enough flexibility so depending on how Lee reacts, Meade can then react as well. So it's not set in stone. But the thing that's really important is on the 26th of November, they want to get across the Rapidan using 3 different fords, push forward, consolidate around this area by the evening of the 26th. That will allow them to get into Lee's rear on the 27th. But winter weather is starting to come in. Dan mentioned that was going to be a factor, and it is. Around the 23rd, there's a huge rainstorm that's going to swell the rivers. It's going to delay that movement, which was supposed to start then. So a couple days later, Meade's going to then push forward. But that rain from earlier in the month had swollen the rivers, making them deeper and wider. So Meade knew he had to get across the rivers, but doesn't take into account the extra pontoons that are going to be necessary to get across those wider rain-swollen rivers. So that's going to delay his crossing at his middle and his upriver crossing. He's going to basically divide his army into 3 columns. Along the downriver side, tardy George Sykes, in charge of the 5th Corps, is going to lead the way, followed by the incredibly mediocre John Newton leading the 1st Corps. They're actually going to get across the river, and Meade's going to tell them, wait, stop, because if you get too far, I can't support you. The rest of the army can't get across the river. And so tardy George, fastest across the river, is actually told to slow down. In the meantime, at the middle crossing, that's where the 2nd Corps, under the temporary command of Gouverneur K. Warren, is supposed to get across the river. They find themselves one pontoon boat short. So engineers are going to have to build a trestle to allow the 2nd Corps to get across, and they'll eventually get about 2 or 3 miles away from the river by the end of the day. Meanwhile, on the upriver crossing, Blinky French, and I got to do this and give us some blinks for old French, he's commanding the 3rd Corps. He is supposed to then get across the river, followed by John Sedgwick and the 6th Corps. And French also finds himself with too few pontoons. And he doesn't do a very good job of scouting out the river crossing. His lead division under Henry Prince gets down there and he's like, oh, wait, a river, oh. Yeah, he was slow getting going, which causes a traffic jam with the 6th Corps behind him. So things really get off to a terribly tangled mess on French's front. Once he finally gets across, because of the rain and the swollen river, he can't get his artillery across because the far bank is too high at Jacobs Ford. So he's got to send his artillery around to the 2nd Corps crossing at Germanna Ford and come with them and then relink. So that adds to the delay. By the time Prince's division gets across, they then take the wrong road and darkness sets in and they're marching. And I love this line, they discover that they are deep within the bowels of the enemy. So then they got to back up, camp, and then it's finally on the morning of the 27th that Meade's able to kind of start pushing forward to consolidate at this intersection. That basically gives Lee an entire day to react. And Lee's got a great observation post at a place called Clark's Mountain, which is off in that direction. He sees all of this happen. There's a little fog on the morning of the 26th, which covers the movements of the Army of the Potomac. But once that fog starts to lift, Lee can clearly see these veins of blue crossing the countryside. And so he's going to mobilize his army. He's going to bring his 2nd Corps up in this direction to try to get this intersection first. That 2nd Corps is commanded temporarily by his bad old man, Jubal Early. Should be commanded by Richard Ewell, but Ewell, as you know, was injured at the Battle of 2nd Manassas, had his leg amputated, and that stump has begun to give him lots of problems. So he's having some health issues related to that. He's back in Richmond recovering, and so old Jube gets the call up to be temporarily in command of the 2nd Corps. Lee's 3rd Corps under A.P. Hill is going to come up on the old plank road, the orange plank road, a little to our south. Lee's going to travel with Hill personally. Hill has not had a very good fall campaign so far. Got his nose bloodied at Bristoe Station. Go back and see our videos from that. Kevin Pollock talks a little bit about that and why Hill finds himself in trouble. So Lee is going to take a much more active hand in controlling and commanding Hill down on that southern front, which is then eventually going to put him as far away from the fighting here on the 27th as he could possibly be. And of course, where's old Pete, the 1st Corps commander? He's out in Chattanooga. He's out in Knoxville. He got sent there in September to help turn the tide at the Battle of Chickamauga. He's still out there under independent command. So that means that Lee's got a diminished army here, but he's trying to move actively. The Federals outnumber him about 5-3, which is a fairly close ratio compared to these two armies as they get during the war. And so that's why Lee's trying to make something happen, why he responds aggressively to Meade's movement, why he's hoping to catch Meade out here. On the 27th, Gouverneur K. Warren's 2nd Corps is literally going to race up the road behind us, off from my right to this area, even as Jubal Early is going to cross Mine Run off to my left, coming up here, and Warren is going to get here first. And so this ridge line that we see behind me is going to serve as Warren's artillery platform. It's one of the very few open areas here because we are in the Virginia wilderness, 70 square miles of second growth forest. The roads offer open avenues of advance, and there are trees everywhere else. And so this ridge becomes super important for Warren. He captures it first. The other thing that's this intersection is open. It's an area known as Robinson's Tavern, dates back to 1814. Robertson's Tavern, it's often called by officers. I'm gonna have Sarah swing around the camera this way, and if we look past the gas pump, you might see a cream-colored house in the background. That's the original Robinson's Tavern. It used to sit right here, but when this strip mall was put in back in the early 90s, they picked up the house and they moved it off to the back. If you come over here, and actually I'll have Sarah swing her camera over in this direction, just peeking out from behind these bushes, there's an old well. That's the original well for the tavern. There were several buildings as part of the complex here, and then there were woods all around it. So when Warren gets here, he gets this one little open space and he gets this ridge line. And so Early's gonna have to basically try to push his way through the woods and up this road, and artillery is just blasting down there. And so Early's going to find himself quite frustrated. He will eventually see a position back, or remember a position that he saw back on the other side of Mine Run, and late in the day on the 27th, he'll order his men to begin creating a fallback position. We'll get to that in just a few minutes. As Warren is here, he's expecting Sykes' column to link up and protect his left, coming up from the south, and to protect his right, he's expecting Blinky French to arrive and extend the line in this direction. Nobody shows up to help him. And we'll talk about that in some later videos today. But the big question, as Warren is hanging on here, is where's French? Where's French? Andrew Humphreys, Chief of Staff in the Army, sends off these angry letters. They're fantastic because it's like Yosemite Sam with smoke coming out of his ears. That you can see it in the notes that Humphreys sends off to French. Link up with Warren and extend this line. To find out why he's not able to, we're going to jump ahead to a place called Payne's Farm, and we're going to invite you to join us there in our next video commemorating the Mine Run 160th anniversary. I want to thank Dan Davis. I want to thank Sarah K. Bierle. I'm Chris Mackowski, and I want to thank you for all you do to support battlefield preservation and education. Chris Mackowski for the American Battlefield Trust, and I'm on the Payne's Farm battlefield at Mine Run, and we're commemorating the 160th anniversary of the Great Battle Never Fought, the campaign that falls in the forgotten fall of 1863. In our previous video, we talked about how the armies converge in an area known as Locust Grove as George Gordon Meade tries to get around Robert E. Lee's flank and get in his rear, flushing him out of his position. But Lee is able to see what's going on, he responds, and the two armies begin to clash. The idea is that they're going to consolidate around Locust Grove. That's George Gordon Meade's concentration point there. He thought he'd be able to springboard into Lee's rear, but Lee comes up to meet him. So as the armies begin to converge, we're going to see some action that takes place in this area that we're going to talk about. We're on a trail that is maintained by the American Battlefield Trust on property that is preserved by them. We're kind of out at one of the little far corners here, and so from this spot we're going to take a walk out toward the intersection of Jacobs Ford Road and Raccoon Ford Road, because two parts of both armies are going to converge on that point as they're trying to get where they need to be. Sarah K. Bierle behind the camera. Thanks for the great work she's doing. And as we come out here to see what we can see, why look, it's my good friend Dan Davis. That's what we can see.
Hey, good to see you. Hey, imagine that, an American Battlefield Trust employee out on an American Battlefield Trust owned piece of property. It's a beautiful day here at Payne's Farm on the Mine Run battlefield, much different than it was 160 years ago from a weather perspective. By this point in time in November, the weather's starting to turn cold, but as you can see, we have a banner day. It's a great day to be out on the battlefield. And this is a battlefield that you, the members of the American Battlefield Trust, have helped to preserve. This battlefield has not changed very much in the last 160 years. Part of it was wooded. There's a number of ravines that are cut through the course of the battlefield, but as you're going to see in a little bit, there's also some open areas on this field. Now, this was once thought to be a lost battlefield. Not lost that it had been developed, but there was just not a general agreement amongst the historical community as to where this fighting actually took place until one of our friends, Ted Savis, who I'm sure many of you know, a publisher in California, was able to locate this battlefield and work with the trust, and we were able to preserve roughly around 680 acres, the entirety of the Payne's Farm battlefield here in 2002. And as time progressed, we were able to install not only interpretive signs with the help of our friends at Civil War Trails, but trails here as well. So this is a place that you can come out, you can visit. It is, as you can see, rather secluded, but it's a great battlefield to visit pretty much at any time of the year. Again, bring your kids out, bring your pets. This is a place is great for walking your dogs, but come out here and see Payne's Farm, a relatively forgotten part of Virginia and a relatively forgotten campaign that takes place here in the fall of 1864. I'm going to turn it back over to Chris.
So Dan, as we come out here to the intersection, we'll step out just to get out of the leaves a little bit here. The roads that are behind us, they weren't paved in 1863, but this is how the armies start to concentrate as both portions of both armies are looking toward the Robinson's Tavern intersection. Where are we at and what are we looking at?
So we're at a very critical intersection. Behind me is the Zoar Road. This is the Raccoon Ford Road leading up to Raccoon Ford on the Rapidan River in 1863. Behind us is the Jacobs Ford Road leading up to Jacobs Ford, one of a number of many fords along the Rapidan. And the reason why this is a critical intersection is because if Sarah could turn and pan around and look behind us, back down that road is Robinson's Tavern. That is the main concentration point for the Army of the Potomac. You can see the truck coming up toward us right now. Back up along this road is moving Edward Johnson's division of Jubal Early's 2nd Corps from the Army of Northern Virginia. Early's concentrating 2 divisions at Robinson's Tavern to face Gouverneur K. Warren's 2nd Corps from the Army of the Potomac. Johnson is coming from his position up on the Rapidan. This is the main road, the easiest, shortest route to get to Robinson's Tavern and join up with the rest of the 2nd Corps. But panning out over here and behind Chris's shoulder is the Jacobs Ford Road. Coming down the Jacobs Ford Road is the 3rd Corps under our old friend Blinky French. And Chris, why do we call him Blinky?
The more he drinks, the more he blinks. And even by midday on the 27th of November, he is well pickled. In fact, some of his soldiers say that they wish that they could pop that barrel and see how much liquor they could get out of him. And so he's blinking up a storm on the 27th as things begin to unfold.
So folks, in short, he never met a whiskey bottle he didn't like. French's 3rd Corps is coming down the Jacobs Ford Road, followed by Uncle John Sedgwick and the 6th Corps behind the 3rd. And Payne's Farm, as the battle develops, is going to be a meeting engagement as the 3rd Corps comes down. Henry Prince's division is coming down the Jacobs Ford Road, strung out here along the Raccoon Ford Road, and almost nearly to Robinson's Tavern is Edward Johnson's division. Up here in this area is George Maryland Stewart's Brigade, and men from North Carolina and Virginia. Farther on down the line is the Stonewall Brigade under James Walker, Louisiana Tigers under Leroy Stafford, and finally John M. Jones's Virginians, who are leading Johnson's column. Chris?
Now, it's important, there are 4,400 Confederates through here. They are going to be coming in right on Gouverneur K. Warren's right flank. So there is a bit of jeopardy that could unfold here. But because French is coming down this road, he's actually going to distract Johnson. French gets as far as an intersection that's just a couple miles up the road here by the home of Widow Morris. And he is explicitly told, when you get to that intersection, take the left-hand road. So when he gets there, he's like, what road should I take? And he'll spend a couple hours scouting out both paths. Meade told him, don't go straight, because if you do, you could potentially run into conflict with Confederates who are coming up from that way. So Meade anticipates that there could be trouble, and he wants French to take that left, and French doesn't. Instead, he's going to send out skirmishers. Massachusetts will push through the woods in this direction, and they're going to bump into pickets who are guarding this column as it moves. And both sides think that they're encountering dismounted cavalry, so they misread the situation. And so that's going to then start to really kind of escalate off in the woods here. But Dan, let me bring you on here. So if we're talking about 4,400 Confederates, we've got 2 Federal Corps, 32,000 men bottled up this road. Those numbers don't seem like they add up very well, and yet we're going to have to see some surprising action here.
We certainly are, and I think one of the critical elements of this fight is that as the 3rd Corps is coming down Jacobs Ford Road, they're hitting the Johnson's column where the Johnson's wagons and artillery are strung out along the road here. So this is very critical. Johnson has to defend this part of, or this portion of his line. He can't let those wagons and artillery fall into the hands of the Federals. Now, as you mentioned, the Massachusetts men first, 11th Massachusetts, eventually I think the 120th New York, are going to be again pushing down into this area. They're going to engage Stuart's men here. Stuart is going to pull back. He's up here along the road, but he's going to pull back into the woods onto the other side of the road and sort of regroup. But at the same time, he sends a rider back down the road toward Robinson's Tavern to apprise Johnson of this evolving battle on his front late in the afternoon. This is one of the more interesting parts about this engagement. It's fought late in the day. Remember, we're on daylight savings time. They aren't. But at the same time, it's still going to be dark out here at 5 o'clock. And you're going to be moving and maneuvering through these dense woods and open field that we'll visit in just a few minutes. But it's going to be a very short engagement, but a very fierce engagement. We know that from the accounts of the men who fought here on both sides, who talk about this being just a very close-in, very savage fight.
What really amazes me is that Johnson's men here, these are the guys who fight at Culp's Hill at Gettysburg. And they talk about this being as fierce a fight as they have ever been in. Now, if you compare that to the fact that the fight that they were in Culp's Hill was pretty darn fierce, that tells you just how ferocious this is going to get. One North Carolinian says it was like they began to throw mini balls by the bucketful at us when the engagement began. Now, Johnson gets word that there are Federals poking his side, and he immediately turns around and comes back here, and he's going to launch his 4,400 men against this Federal force. He doesn't know what the size is. We know that the Federals outnumber the Confederates here 6-1. In terms of forces engaged, it's 3-1. So we'll leave it up to you to decide whether Johnson is brave or foolhardy in bringing this engagement on, but it's going to have huge implications as this campaign unfolds.
Absolutely, and as Johnson, just as aggressive as Johnson is, the Federals are somewhat a little bit intimidated by what they find out here. They're not expecting to find the Confederates. Prince is not at the top of the list of officers that you would want leading your column if you're Blinky French, and that's going to play out here through the course of the latter part of the afternoon. And when Johnson arrives here, he wants to attempt what is known as a double envelopment. He wants to send Walker's Stonewall Brigade forward to hit what he believes to be the Federal center, while Stuart is going to swing around and strike the Federal right, and then he's going to bring up Stafford and Jones to swing around and strike the Federal left, and pretty much try to encircle this column, maybe a little bit over aggressive because he doesn't exactly know what he's facing out here.
Now, Dan happens to be conveniently wearing blue. I'm wearing gray, so I'm going to be Johnson's division, and you're going to be the Federals that are up there on the road. And basically, we're going to just try to do this, that double envelopment. When Stuart's guys push forward, they're going to basically try to swing like a door in this direction. That's one brigade versus the other three. So as the other three kind of pinwheel around, it's going to take them longer to get into position than it will for Stuart. And we'll talk a little bit more about that specifically when we get out to our next stop. But here, as Stuart swings into the position, his far rear regiment, the 37th Virginia, finds itself isolated because there are sections of the Excelsior Brigade, the 70th and 71st New York, that swing down across this road and get into Stuart's rear. So those Virginians aren't able to swing forward because they're busy protecting the flank. Titus Williams, no one would have expected him to be a great, brilliant military commander. He graduates 24th out of the class of 27 at VMI, and yet he has done well at First Manassas. He's really distinguished himself at Cedar Mountain, and here he finds himself in this position of jeopardy. If you're Titus Williams, one regiment isolated, essentially as this door swings, he's going to find himself 200 yards away from the rest of his support. If you're him, what do you do in a situation like that?
Well, Titus Williams, the first thing he does is he keeps his head. He keeps cool, which is very important because he's the far Confederate left flank. If his regiment gives way, then the rest of the line back here along the road, and at that point in time, they're moving up toward to attack the Federals, that entire Confederate line could ostensibly give way as well. So what does Titus Williams do? He decides to extend his front as much as possible. Rather than fighting in the traditional linear style, the two lines of men, he decides to push all of his men up into one single line and extended out as far as he could to deceive the Federals and make them think that they're facing a larger force than what he actually has.
It's one of my most favorite examples of battlefield theatrics because he basically presents himself as a skirmish line, which makes the Excelsior men think like, ooh, there's someone behind them, because your skirmish line pushes out in front of your main force. So that spooks the New Yorkers, who then fall back, and that gives Williams the time to consolidate and get back here and get connected with the rest of Stuart's men. Off to the rear, you can't see it behind that blue house, but there's a big ravine that also is going to play a role in this battle, because the New Yorkers are able to kind of get up and through that ravine, and that's what allows them to get behind, but then they fall back into that ravine for protection and can't see some of the action that's going on here. As Stuart's men push forward, they're going to meet some stout resistance from the lead regiments from Prince's division, but they will eventually begin to crumble, because over here we're going to see the Stonewall Brigade begin its sweeping forward, sweeping pinwheel forward, and that's going to dislodge the left flank of Prince's men, and they're going to fall back. They're going to get some unexpected support from some artillery that's going to change the tide of battle along here.
Yeah, and one of the other interesting things I find about this battle is it reminds me a lot of the August 1780 Battle of Camden in South Carolina. And when I say that, what I mean by that is, depending on where you are standing at any given point in time on the battlefield, at least in the instance of Camden, the British have the upper hand or the Continentals have the upper hand. It's the same thing here. The Confederates here in this sector are going to have the initial upper hand by driving Blaisdell's men back up the Jacobs Ford Road and threatening those artillery pieces. But as we explore this battlefield a little bit more, we get out into the open ground, we're going to find that in a different sector of this battlefield, the Federals are going to have the upper hand.
When those artillery pieces do finally deploy, it's going to give the 11th New Jersey, which was at the center of the line, a place to then reform. Their color bearer is going to take his flag out, plant it in the middle of the road with those artillery pieces around him. The artillerists say that they had so much cannon to bring to bear that they cleared out 4 or 5 acres of woods and as many Confederates. Confederates are actually going to put an artillery battery here in the middle of the road and try to fight back and forth along the open stretch of the road, but we got a lot of woods on either side, so it's not necessarily very good artillery terrain to begin with. But as Dan says, on the other side of the battlefield, things are going to take place that are going to change what happens over here.
And let's head to that section of the battlefield.
Very good, let's go. So Sarah K. Bierle behind the camera. Through the magic of technology and video editing and the power of our own 6 legs, we have walked the trail and we've come out here to the open part of the Payne's Farm battlefield. Dan, tell us what we're looking at here.
Well, we're looking at what the soldiers from the Stonewall Brigade, Leroy Stafford's Louisiana's, John Jones's Virginians, who are going to fight up here, are pretty much going to see at the time of the battle. This field has not changed in 160 years. This is an open field cut again by several ravines. And there's also going to be some Union soldiers who see this, specifically Union soldiers from the brigades of William Morris and J. Warren Kiefer. And if you can see down into the far tree line, that is going to be their position. And it's also through that far tree line is the main Union position along Jacobs Ford Road. Now, as the battle has evolved, as we walk from George Stewart's sector of the line, we made it over here, and we're standing roughly around the area where James Walker's, Stonewall Jim's Stonewall Brigade was positioned through the early stages of the fighting. Now, the Federals have extended their line up to that far tree line, spread out toward and from Jacobs Ford Road to deal with part of Johnson's envelopment. At one point in time, the 2nd Virginia Infantry is going to come through these woods here, out into this open field. They're going to make it out into the open field, and then they're going to be hit by devastating fire. They're going to be plastered by from musketry coming from Morris's position down in that far tree line. That's going to cause Walker's men to pull back into these woods, but at about the same time, Leroy Stafford's Louisianans are going to be arriving on the field from behind the camera and coming up into position along this farm lane that we're standing along. This is a historic farm lane. This was here at the time of the battle. And so Stafford's men are going to wheel from the Raccoon Ford Road up onto this ridge facing the Union brigades in the far tree line. And then on the other side of Stafford, John Jones's Virginians are going to arrive. And this is going to be the Confederate attack field. They're going to begin pushing Stafford and Jones, that is, across this field toward the brigades of Morris and Kiefer. And this fighting is going to go on for the better part, Chris, I would say maybe a better part of an hour to an hour and a half as the Confederates try to push across this field and drive the Federals back toward Jacobs Ford Road.
And unfortunately, because of that large nature of the pinwheel, Jones' men take longer to get on the battlefield than Stafford's. They took longer to get on the battlefield than the Stonewall Brigade. And so the piecemeal attacks are going to prevent Johnson from getting everybody in at once and being able to make any concerted effort across this field. The other thing that really works against him, and that's why I love the fact that this is so well preserved, the topography is really going to work against the Confederates here. As they begin to deploy on this part of the battlefield, they really think they're going to be sweeping up onto the flank of the Federal position. As the 3rd Corps was coming down the Jacobs Ford Road, they deployed perpendicular to that road. But as Carr's division comes into the left of Prince's, it curves back in sort of a U shape. That's what's going to allow Morris and Kiefer to be in that far tree line instead of having their flank against this field. So the shape of that Union line is going to then play against the Confederates. Also, the shape of this field is going to play against the Confederates. We're actually standing kind of basically at the little crook of a V, and one leg of the V goes that way and one leg of the V goes this way. So when Stonewall Jim Walker's men go riding out into that field, they're basically riding across the front of the Federals who've deployed over there, and that is what leads them to withering fire. Now that attack does cause the Federals to break for a little bit. There's going to be some hand-to-hand fighting in there. It's going to get intense, but when Carr's men deploy, they're going to kind of shore up Prince's defenses. We talked a little bit about Stuart crushing things on that end. That's what's going to lead to the Federals to kind of fall back, and then the redeployment of the Federals is going to then put the Stonewall Brigade in jeopardy out here. So topography plays a key role in how these attacks unfold and who falls prey to who.
Yeah, it certainly does, and I think there's a couple of other factors that play into how this action eventually shakes out. We talked about Johnson's division being veteran soldiers. They'd fought at Culp's Hill, at Gettysburg. Well, any veteran soldier worth their salt is not going to want to advance across this open field toward an enemy holding a strong position. And that results in several disjointed attacks going forward. The 10th Louisiana from Stafford's brigade ventures into this field roughly about 3 times before they're driven back. But another factor that's going to come into play is the fact that John Jones is going to be wounded very early in the fighting. He's going to be out of action. And so command is going to evolve to a fellow named William Witcher. But those two factors, the loss of one of your brigade commanders as well as the terrain, the open field, is going to play into the Federals being able to hold this position as the afternoon goes along. Interestingly enough, Chris, both Stafford and Jones are going to die several months later and several miles from where we're standing here at Payne's Farm in the wilderness on May 5th, 1864.
Ironic that they, Jones is wounded in the head here, survives, and then ends up dying just down the road. And that leadership vacuum is really important. I mean, when Jim Walker gets out into the field, he gets almost to the Federal line, and his men are getting chewed up, and his men get pushed back. So then he grabs some colors and rides out into the field again, trying to use personal leadership to rally his men, realizing nobody's followed him, and he'll go back to the safety of the woods off to my right. But then there's a color bearer from a Virginia regiment that takes his colors out into the field and plants them. And the Federals start shooting at him, and then an officer on the side says, stop, don't shoot him. That man is too brave to die. And so leadership is really an important element on what's going on here. But ultimately, numbers are going to help the Federals. They've got a huge advantage here. The Federals are throwing so much lead into the air on the far side of the field. The Carr's men begin to run out of ammunition. David Bell Birney's men will have to come in as their relief because they've got more ammunition. They're able to replenish the supplies.
Yeah, that's a very important aspect of this fight, is just as Morris and Kiefer are running out of ammunition, the Federals are putting fresh troops onto the field. So all essentially the Federals on the front line need to do is just pull back, and there are fresh brigades waiting to come up and take their position to continue laying down just a horrendous fire across this field.
And we still haven't seen anybody from the 6th Corps. In fact, they say they're hoping to get into the battle, and they just can't. The bottleneck over there is so strong they can't even get onto the field. But this is really key, because regardless of how the actual fight on the field unfurls, 32,000 Federals have been tied up. Throughout the day, Andrew Humphreys has been telling French, get over here, deploy, extend your left, hook up with Warren, and he's not able to. And since French is not able to, then Sedgwick is not able to. So the 4,400 Confederates that fight here have a huge operational impact on this battle by bottling up 2/5 of the Union Army.
Absolutely, and I believe Andrew Humphreys, the Chief of Staff, is going to write after this battle about the great opportunity that was missed because French has Sedgwick sitting right behind him, a fresh Union Corps that is ready to come onto the field. But French, again, not among the A-listers. He's not going to be able to pull up John Sedgwick. And eventually, Mother Nature is going to play a role into this. Darkness is going to fall across the field. It's completely pitch black, really, at about 5 o'clock. You've got men back here in the woods. You've got men out here in this open field. Johnson realizes that for all of his effort in trying to attack the Federal forces, he has really just added to a long list of casualties.
So, and I don't know how far into the alphabet we have to get before we find out where French is. He's not an A-lister, he's not a B-lister. I don't know how far we go. Johnson really performs well. French will get relieved as a result of this when the army's reorganized. And Johnson, who writes his report for this battle pretty late, takes pride in it. And he's like, yeah, basically, I got this dude fired for the way that he performed here. Johnson's going to pull back and link up with the rest of the Confederates as they fall back across Mine Run into that position that Jubal Early scouted out earlier in the day that we talked about in an earlier video. French is going to try to talk about the sanguinary efforts here, blah, 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 blink, 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 blink. But the fact is, he was out of this battle at a time Meade desperately needed him to link up. John Haley, the 17th Maine, he's got a great memoir. He says, the real tragedy of this fight is that we weren't even supposed to be on this road to begin with. If French had taken the left turn at Widow Morris's, he would have linked up with Warren when and where he was supposed to, and this battle would have never taken place. Instead, there are going to be thousands of casualties over here, about 1,200, almost 1,300 Federal casualties, a little over 600 Confederate casualties, and there shouldn't have been casualties because there shouldn't have been a battle. In the meantime, on the far south part of the battlefield, near New Hope Church, the third column of Meade's advance is also going to run into trouble. We're going to explore that part of the battlefield next and figure out how does Meade then react and respond to the slowness that has ground his campaign to an unfortunate halt. With Dan Davis, Sarah K. Bierle, I'm Chris Mackowski. Thanks for being with us here on the Mine Run 160th. We're here at Payne's Farm. Come out, check things out. You can explore this great Civil War trail site for yourself. Bring your family. It's a beautiful, beautiful spot to be, and it's made possible by the work that you have done to support battlefield preservation and education. We're standing along the Orange Plank Road. If we were to continue off in that direction, it would take us to Orange Courthouse, the county seat of Orange County. If we were to go in that direction, it'll take us up into the wilderness. This is sort of kind of one of the edges of the wilderness. We're going to push off into that direction to get it out of the wilderness and into civilization. Mine Run itself is just a couple miles off to my right in that direction, but the opening engagements here take place to the east of Mine Run. We're at a location known as New Hope Church, one of several churches that was built by Melcy Chancellor. This one dates back to 1857, although the rebuilt church was put up in 1908, I believe it was, and then we've had lots of expansions and stuff. Just a really neat little bustling church here out here in Mine Run, a little village called Golddale, if we're talking about the specifics of the settlement. And it's here where we're going to have some of the first actions on the southernmost part. We talked about the three prongs of approach that the Federals are taking. We've talked a little bit about Gouverneur K. Warren's 2nd Corps coming down the middle along the Orange Turnpike, which is off to my left just a couple miles, straight shot into Orange County. We also talked about French and Sedgwick, the 3rd and 6th Corps coming across Jacobs Ford and then getting themselves into trouble at Payne's Farm. And here along Orange Plank Road, we have got the First Corps following the 5th Corps. And to get those Federals onto the field, I'm going to ask Dan Davis to come and talk a little bit about the advance of Tardy George.
Thank you. The 1st and 5th Corps are going to cross the Rapidan at Culpeper Mine Ford and begin moving down into this area. Meade has ordered these 2 corps to come down and extend the Union left. They are going to be the Union left flank, the right flank then moving up toward the Orange Turnpike to connect with Gouverneur Warren at Robinson's Tavern. But as the Union infantry are making their way into this area, they're preceded by Union cavalry under David McMurtry Gregg, and then coming up along the Orange Plank Road from the direction of Orange is Jeb Stuart and the Confederate cavalry. Now Jeb Stuart is preceding Henry Heath's division from A.P. Hill's 3rd Corps. Lee is accompanying Hill, as Chris mentioned in an earlier video, along the Orange Plank Road. But again, out in front is Jeb Stuart and his cavalry. Now, Jeb Stuart is wearing 2 hats during the fall of 1863. He's not only commanding all of Lee's cavalry, but he's the de facto commander for Wade Hampton's division. Wade Hampton had been wounded at the Battle of Gettysburg on July 3rd, 1863, and he's out of action. So Stuart is out here acting not only as the overall cavalry commander, but as a division commander. And it's with Hampton's division that he's going to begin engaging with David Gregg's Union cavalrymen. There's going to be a lot of skirmishing, moving back and forth throughout the area that we're standing in until the infantry is eventually going to get up and deploy onto the field of battle. But the cavalry fighting isn't over yet. Just a couple days later, Tom Roster's Virginia Brigade is actually going to swing into the Union rear, capturing a number of Union wagons and artillery pieces as the main infantry fighting is taking place to the north at Payne's Farm, and is again spreading through this area as Meade makes plans, lays plans to get at Lee after the fighting at Payne's Farm. I'd like to bring Chris back on to talk a little bit more about what's going on in the Union headquarters after the fighting at Payne's Farm.
So the slow escalation here on this side of the battlefield really kind of then deprives Meade of having additional forces back at Robinson's Tavern at that concentration that he was hoping for. And so as a result, Meade's got to figure out what to do next. So on the morning of the 28th, he's going to cautiously advance across his whole line. He'll finally have the troops here. Newton's going to kind of swing in and extend Warren's line in this direction. Sykes will be able to connect. They're all going to push forward. French and Sedgwick are going to be able to push forward, and the Confederates seem to be gone. They're going to get all the way down to the banks of Mine Run and suddenly see on the far side this incredibly powerful set of works that seems to have been magically thrown up overnight, and realize that they were going to have to cross this stream, go across open fields of fire uphill against this new position. And no easy places to cross the stream. Confederates are going to dam it up in places. One soldier says it becomes a veritable Red Sea to us. It was dammed by the Confederates and it was dammed by us. And so Meade's going to try to figure out, gosh, are there any weak spots? His corps commanders can't find any. And again, this is all because things were slowed down on the crossing on the 26th. The inability for the army to concentrate on the 27th. He's lost his element of surprise, and now what? And as Sarah mentioned in our first video, Ulysses S. Grant had a victory out in Chattanooga. Lincoln at the Gettysburg Address has redefined what this war is all about. Incredible political pressure, and Meade finds himself stymied. So one of his corps commanders, Gouverneur K. Warren, the wonderkind of this army, is going to come to him with an idea. Rather than try to push across the stream, why not do a flank march through this area where we're standing along an unfinished railroad that is off to my right, kind of behind Sarah. It's extending all the way back to Orange. This is the same unfinished railroad that will play a key role in the Battle of the Wilderness. It goes all the way to Fredericksburg. It played a battle in the role in Fredericksburg. And what Warren wants to do is move his guys down there and get on Lee's right flank and attack. And so Meade gives him permission to do that. It's going to take all day on the 29th for Warren to swing his men. He's going to have about 28,000 men to make this movement with. And I always think, 28,000 men moving through the wilderness to get on someone's flank. This is sounding familiar to me if anybody's flashing back to Chancellorsville. And Warren is going to get over into position. I'm going to ask Dan to come back on here in a second because, Dan, it seems like the stakes are high for Warren making this movement. And he gets where he needs to be, but...
I couldn't agree more. In fact, Meade bases his entire plan off of Warren's movement. Whatever Warren finds, however his fighting on his front develops, is going to dictate what Meade does later on through the course of the fighting. Meade eventually is going to plan to have Warren swing around Lee's right flank. He's going to use the remaining troops to probe Lee's center and then order John Sedgwick way back up on the right near Payne's farm to make an attack against Lee's far left flank, which is stretching toward the Rapidan. But all of this hinges on Gouverneur Warren. The attack is set to go off at roughly about 8 o'clock in the morning of November the 30th, the last day of November, and it's going to begin at around 8 a.m. with a pre-planned Union artillery barrage emanating from the Union center. Meade is preparing for this attack. He's preparing to send his men forward on both of the flanks. The artillery opens on time as planned, but as Meade is sitting back up near the Orange Turnpike, he can't see down to this area, but he can definitely hear down to this area. And he hears nothing but silence. And 8:15 comes along, silence. 8:30, it's about 8:50, about an hour behind schedule. A rider's going to come up to Meade, a dispatch from Warren, telling him that Warren has decided to postpone the attack. He has found that the Confederate defenses are too strong, and indeed they are, because Jeb Stuart is eyes of Lee's army. He's been out here watching Warren's movement. He's reporting back through the course of the previous day to Lee, and Lee orders Hill to extend his line, extend his right flank down into this area, and to continue to build those fortifications. And Meade is going to receive word that the Confederate defenses are too strong. Warren has decided not to launch the attack. And again, the entire operation is based off of what Warren is planning to do. So Meade himself, he's going to ride down here and confer with Warren, and it's going to be a very volatile exchange, to say the least, between the two officers.
Part of the problem is that Warren took all day to get here on the 29th, and so he loses that element of surprise. He's going to camp overnight. One of the myths of Mine Run is that he lights a bunch of campfires to show his mighty host, an effort to scare Lee out of his position. But Lee is just going to extend that line, bring in all of his reserves. Dan talked about Jeb Stuart kind of serving as a division commander. They will get with Hampton's men into Warren's rear and kind of get a good sense of what the picture looks like. And that's what allows Lee to have the confidence to extend that line. So when Warren wakes up and he sees these works, and remember, he's a trained engineer, and he's looking at these works that appeared overnight, and he's like, can't do it. When he sends word back to Meade, Meade's head explodes. He's like, the man has half of my army. He has ruined me. Again, think about the stakes for Meade at this point. And so he thunders down here, as Dan said, have this heated exchange. And Warren said, by the full light of day, I realized the assault could not be made. And under my own power, I called it off. And he shows Meade, who's also a trained engineer, what's going on. And Meade comes to the same conclusion. And I really like this decision. Despite all of the pressure on Meade to do something, he recognizes that his men were going to be in open, exposed position for 8 minutes to cross the terrain to assault that position in cold weather that will freeze wounded men to death out on the field. He doesn't want to throw the lives of his men away against a position he knows he can't take. So he's going to spend the rest of the day like, oh, what do I do, looking for some other option, and he can't find one. So that next night, his men will light campfires, so bitterly cold that soldiers freeze to death on the picket line. And Meade will take the opportunity to finally escape Lee, very happy to be behind his works, will let that happen. Not realizing it's going on, Lee will finally decide to launch an attack, but by that point, Meade has slipped away. But Dan, I know that you've studied Meade's reaction. Once they finally get back to their camps in Culpeper, he writes a very telling letter to his wife that sort of captures his own frustrations here.
Yeah, absolutely. And Meade's options are very few when he finds that he cannot launch the big assault on November the 30th. He can continue forward with the attack, which, as Chris mentioned, would probably be suicidal, not only for the Army, but for his own career. He can pull off to Fredericksburg, but that would leave the road open to Washington and expose Washington. And also, because of the defeat the previous December, the Union Army is not going to be operating around Fredericksburg. So Meade decides to disengage, withdraw back over the Rapidan. Himself is going to set up his headquarters near St. James's Church on the old Brandy Station battlefield, and there he will spend the winter of 1863 and 1864. But as Chris mentioned, Meade is going to write a very telling letter back home. And I think this letter is interesting for a couple of reasons. First off, if you read through the letter, Meade does not name any of his subordinate commanders. He is that angry with, I think, what happened here, or what did not happen here, I should say. But he's also going to write, through this roughly 2-page letter, a very telling sentence. And it reflects his mindset here on November the 30th of 1864. And he writes that I would rather be ignominiously dismissed and suffer anything than knowingly and willingly have thousands of brave men slaughtered for nothing. Meade shows great moral fortitude here at Mine Run by not going forward and launching that grand attack, despite the fact that he knows that he is going to come under immense criticism from the Lincoln administration. And I mentioned that Meade spends the winter in Culpeper County. Well, he's going to be in Culpeper County near Brandy Station for the winter of 1863-64, but he's also going to be spending time between Culpeper and Washington, D.C., testifying before the Joint Committee on the Conduct of the War regarding his actions not only here at Mine Run, but also during the Gettysburg Campaign as well. Chris?
And he writes that letter to his wife, and the opening sentence is amazing. I mean, he says, "You will be gratified to know that your fondest wish will finally come true, and I'm apt to be relieved." He expects to get fired as a result of this. And there are days of tension as Meade's waiting for the axe to fall, but it doesn't fall. In part because he does have a lot of subordinates who go to Washington and lobby on his behalf. The Army itself is a little frustrated by what happened here because we did all this moving. They start this on Thanksgiving Day. They don't even get a Thanksgiving meal of hardtack as a result. And so there's a lot of frustration, but then they realize, wait, he decided to not throw us into battle. He valued our lives over his own career. And this is where really Meade makes this army his. They love him after this. Up to this point, they respect him. He's their commander. They love him after this because they realize he's not going to needlessly sacrifice their lives. And Meade even says in that letter to his wife, "There'll be some critics who think that I should have tried and failed and let my failure serve as testament to my good judgment." But he doesn't want to let these guys go through that needless slaughter. So it's a great moment of moral courage. The aftermath of battle is also, there are going to be a few thousand casualties on both sides here, but one of the reasons we've stopped here at New Hope Church, and I'm going to bring Sarah on here to talk a little bit about this, is because in the aftermath of battle, we still do have casualties. We still do have men who have to put their shattered lives back together as a result. And we have some poignant testimonies as a result of that kind of speak to the fact that even though there was no great battle, to some of these men it was still a devastating experience in their lives. So Sarah, tell us a little bit about, in the wake of the fighting here, you've got some accounts that really speak to the experience of these men.
I do, and thank you, Chris. One of the things that I like to do, particularly when we're at a big anniversary of a battle or a campaign, is take some time and find individual stories of soldiers who were present there. And one of the ways that I do this is on the Library of Congress's website, where they have fantastic photographs that had been digitized, and we can see them right there. I'm sure you're familiar with Gary Edelman's study of the landscape and battle or photographs of the battlefields. I kind of gravitate toward the portrait photographs a little more. So I found a few soldiers who were here in the Mine Run campaign, and had to search for it in a few different ways because it's Mine Run, it's Payne's Farm, and New Hope Church. And through all of those, you're able to find some really interesting stories. So the first one that I want to show you, this is James P. Mills. He is in the 53rd North Carolina Infantry. And he is actually listed in his service record as being a musician, and he seems to have been a musician through the duration of the war. So he's actually born in Virginia, but then his family moves to North Carolina, which is where he enlists from. He's noted as being a farmer prior to his enlistment on March 27th, 1862, when he signs up for 3 years of service. We know that he was in a hospital during the summer of 1863, possibly sick, maybe even wounded after Gettysburg, but by the fall he's returned to his regiment. He is definitely on the muster and the pay sheets for his regiment in the period of the Mine Run campaign. The 53rd North Carolina Infantry is in Daniel's brigade of Rhodes's division in the 2nd Corps of the Army of Northern Virginia. And General Daniels writes in his report at the very end, complimenting the men in his command, "I feel it my duty to state that in consequence of the extremely inclement weather, the constant labor, marching, and loss of sleep, my officers and men were greatly fatigued. Notwithstanding, they were very vigilant and evinced great cheerfulness and good conduct in the discharge of their duties." And as Chris and Dan have talked about, the weather is very cold. Men are freezing to death in this campaign. So there's high praise there, and that would fall for James P. Mills of the 53rd North Carolina Infantry. He's probably a fifer, perhaps a drummer, maybe a bugler, but he's listed as musician, so a very young man in the regiment. Now, doing a little further research, I found some images that seem to be Mills later in life. So here he is with his family, and this comes from a local historical society in North Carolina. And then this other one was on Library of Congress, in this house that is presumably his, and listed as being shown with his wife and daughter there on the front porch as well. So here we have a soldier who survives the war, survives this campaign, and actually all the soldiers I'm featuring or talking about in this video, they all survive, so spoiler alert there. The next soldier's image that I came across is Henry D. Scott. And at the time of the Mine Run campaign, he's in the 5th Massachusetts Light Artillery Battery. He'll actually change artillery units, and we'll find him in a different Massachusetts battery when we get to the Overland Campaign in 1864. But he's actually out here in the fighting that's happening around the vicinity of New Hope Church, which we were talking about a bit earlier in this video. And he writes about the Mine Run campaign and his experience in the battle. So I'll share a little bit of that. So this is post-war writing. It actually appears in the 5th Massachusetts Battery Regimental History, or I guess it would be Battery History. The 5th Army Corps found the enemy strongly entrenched beyond Mine Run, a treacherous stream. The 5th Corps occupied the left of the line of battle, the right reaching all the way to Robertson's Tavern. He means Robinson's Tavern. As Chris mentioned earlier, they'll sometimes mix the names there. The whole country was almost a wilderness. All the army was up at this point. On November 27, 1863, the 5th Massachusetts Battery stood in line of battle on a rise of ground, in a lane, scrub and brushwood on either side, and a dense forest of pines, but a short distance across an open swale. Nothing was to be seen in front. Sounds like a little bit of an odd place to place an artillery battery. He goes on our right, we could see a battery engaged and shells were exploding all about us. A lead horse of the battery was struck by a piece of shell and dropped to its knees, but was not killed. An officer rode up to Captain Phillips and asked why he was not engaged. Phillips replied he had no orders, nor could he see anything to fire at. They've got all this woods in front of them. The officer said, "Use your judgment as an officer. Fire over the woods to your front." So the battery filed into the brush on the left of the lane and opened fire through the woods. No enemy was to be seen, and our troops on the left, as far as could be seen, were lying on the ground face down, knapsacks on their backs. A lull came in the firing, and the men of the battery set to work cutting down the trees and brush to enable the cannoneers to get the limber about in case we had to move out. While we were about this duty, a sharp fragment of a shell struck the forefinger of my left hand, and I rode to a hospital in the rear to have it dressed. Returning to the battery, I found it had been decided that the left was unassailable. So that's the Warren's decision, which Meade backs up. The artillery was ordered to Robertson's Tavern, but remained in position during the night. So Lieutenant Scott, he has a very minor injury, an inconvenience, if you will. He goes back to a hospital, has this wound on his left hand bandaged, and then he actually comes back to the battery, because in later notes in the battery's history, we find that he actually goes back to a hospital, meaning he had returned to the regiment at some point. But he'll survive the injury and, as I mentioned earlier, change batteries in the spring of 1864. So one other photo that I found that I wanted to share with you, this is Henry P. Bowditch, and he is an officer in the 1st Massachusetts Cavalry. So if you are a fan of maritime history or like navigation and mathematics, this is one of the grandsons of American mathematician Nathaniel Bowditch, who wrote, I believe it's Aids to Navigation. We can check that and I'll be corrected in a text, I'm sure. But this Bowditch, Henry Bowditch, graduates from Harvard in 1861. He will survive the war. He'll actually go back to Harvard, graduate from their medical school in 1868, and then eventually, much later in his illustrious career, become dean of that medical school. But in 1861, he enlists. He's a 2nd lieutenant in the 1st Massachusetts Cavalry. He's 21 years old. He's risen to the rank of captain by autumn of 1863. And in the cavalry fighting, which Dan has briefly mentioned here around New Hope Church, he is wounded in the right arm. And his wounding is noted by other soldiers. He's actually going to come in contact with probably one of the most famous wounded soldiers at the New Hope location, and that is Charlie Longfellow. So Bowditch and Longfellow will actually both end up getting evacuated in a same ambulance after having their wounds initially bandaged. Both will survive their injuries. Now, who is Charlie Longfellow? He is the eldest son of the American poet Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, who wrote Paul Revere's Ride and many other famous poems that have come into American memory of history and all of that. So the news of Charlie Longfellow's injury is going to be sent to Massachusetts, and the Longfellow family has already been through a lot in recent years. Henry Longfellow had lost his wife in a tragic accident. He's raising their young children on his own. His son Charlie runs off against his father's wishes and ends up in the military, connected to the 1st Massachusetts Cavalry. And Charlie's badly wounded here in the fighting around New Hope Church. And it's in the midst of the tension and the uncertainty of getting the news that his son has been injured, possibly dying, that Longfellow writes what becomes a famous Christmas song. It's called I Heard the Bells on Christmas Day. And if you go and look at all the verses, it talks about the cannon's mouth and these questions of how can there be peace on earth. And it's really questions that Longfellow was struggling with, and that in many ways people were struggling with in homes all across America, in North and South. And so this poetry is written, becomes a song. Without the historical context of it, it can seem like a very dark, a very sad Christmas song, but the ending is a hopeful part. Then pealed the bells more loud and deep, God is not dead, nor does he sleep. The wrong shall fail, the right prevail, and peace on earth, goodwill to men, is kind of Longfellow's conclusion there. So it takes a end of year campaign And from that comes a Christmas song that many of us are probably still familiar with. Chris, do you have other things to add?
And most modern renditions of the carol leave out the booming cannons
Yes,
and the
they
cannons
do.
and all that stuff too. So we have this warm.
But you kind of have to, at least in the church hymnals, you kind of have to do all 5 verses that they do print, or else it kind of doesn't make sense. It's a very narrative poetry, so at least it's there, but they do leave the canon part out.
Right.
Not quite great for Christmas Eve services.
But kind of a neat connection that we have here to this campaign that most people sort of forget about. I'm going to ask Dan Davis to come back here in just a second, because we also have another legacy here, and that, of course, is battlefield preservation. And the American Battlefield Trust has done some great work here on this front of the battlefield. The Payne's Farm preservation dates back to the early 2000s. This is brand spanking new. Tell us about it, Dan.
It is. It's new as of May of this year, and here we are in November on the precipice, or really commemorating the 160th anniversary of the Mine Run campaign. And it's very appropriate that just several months ago, again back in May, back in the spring, working with interested landowners, we were able to put under easement over 700 acres, a very large chunk. Think about that. 700 acres. We typically don't get the opportunity to preserve such large tracts all at once, but we have here at Mine Run. Mine Run's somewhat unique. We have the 680 acres at Payne's Farm, and now over 700 acres here under easement. And we could not have done this without your support. And so I would like for all of you who are watching, especially members of the American Battlefield Trust, if you're not a member, head over to battlefields.org, get some more information, but especially to our members, thank you so much for supporting battlefield preservation and education. We could not do and accomplish all that we have without your generous support. So on behalf of all of us, I say thank you. And with that, I'm going to bring Chris back on.
So we've given you lots to think about here at Mine Run, and as we wrap up, we tend to jump from Gettysburg to the wilderness, and we forget about that fall. So much happens. The stakes are incredibly high. The politics are incredibly high. The commanders on both sides are facing really keen decisions and putting themselves personally in their careers, in harm's way here at Mine Run. And so what happens as a result of this, we're going to see Ulysses S. Grant, who won at Chattanooga, he's going to get the call to come to the east. Lincoln can't do anything about Meade. He can't fire him because Meade hasn't really done anything wrong. He just hasn't done that next big right thing. So Lincoln solves that problem by promoting Grant over Meade and then leaving Meade in position. He's the victor of the Battle of Gettysburg in Pennsylvania. The elections are coming up, and Lincoln needs Pennsylvania, so he can't poke that beehive and to do anything to the state's favored son. So he brings Grant to the east, and we're going to see a whole new change of warfare. Many aspects of this campaign are going to then expand and play out during the 1864 Overland Campaign. And we're going to see what happens to the Wonder Kid, Gouverneur K. Warren. We're going to see how Meade reacts to that new change in leadership. We're going to see fortifications spring up overnight. A lot of things that we're going to associate with that Overland Campaign, we see first here as a preview. So thanks for spending some time previewing that with us. Check out all our videos on the American Battlefield Trust YouTube page. Lots of resources for you to explore. Go on over to battlefields.org and check out our website for the additional resources we have available there as well. I want to thank Sarah K. Bierle behind the camera for the great work that she's done. Dan Davis, great friend of mine over here, doing fantastic work for us as well. And I want to thank you for everything you do for us. I'm Chris Mackowski for the American Battlefield Trust. Thank you for all you do to support battlefield education and preservation.
Hello, this is Trace Atkins. Get inspired at battlefields.org.